During World War II, Nazi sympathizers in Japan were chief antagonists in Asia, attempting to secure the area to minimize American influence. But when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were forced to surrender. Of course, this meant that the war had categorically come to a close. But with millions of Japanese soldiers spread all across Asia and beyond, there was a big job at hand to get them back to East Asia. So what happened to the millions of Japanese servicemen in the years following the war? Stay with us to find out. Japan, traditionally, has been home to some of the most patriotic and proud people the world has ever known. On August 15, 1945, those patriots were stunned as Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of his country. Many Japanese were convinced that the better option would have been to fight to the death. But the emperor ultimately made a smart decision, having seen what America had in its arsenal. During the war, many Japanese soldiers had fought abroad, mainly in Asia, and just like in any group in any conflict throughout history, had suffered significant losses not only to death, but also capture. In the months following surrender, as these men headed back to Japan, they experienced varying fates. After a long and arduous repatriation process, due to logistical challenges, many were reintegrated into society and lived a relatively normal life, but many others did not. Of course, it wasn't just as simple as everybody just packing up and shipping off home. In the days that followed Hirohito's announcement, the Asian continent was shrouded in ambiguity, and no one actually knew if rumors of a surrender were true. Once they finally knew what was happening, and that they were, in fact, going home, initial disappointment turned into relief. But Japan would be a very different place to the one the average soldier had left in search of global dominance. As we know, the Japanese government were beaten into submission with the atomic bombs, but they were also now being occupied by American forces, who from 1945 to 1952 used the country as a colony, essentially. This did not sit well with the uber-proud Japanese soldier. They had a lot more to contend with than soldiers from Western countries, too. In the West, soldiers are generally lauded as heroes, win or lose, which is a nod to their bravery and the fact they are willing to fight for their country. This line of thinking doesn't quite translate into Japanese, and the servicemen who returned to Japan in defeat were often seen as and treated like cowards, quite unbelievably. Because of this, they tended to hide the fact that they had been captured by Allied soldiers in a bid to save face. Soldiers were gradually reintegrated into society, but considering what they had been through, many suffered from conditions such as PTSD and were psychologically scarred by what they had witnessed and, more often, taken part in. Not only were a lot of men wounded mentally, but also physically. Many soldiers had lost limbs or suffered disfigurement, which would seriously affect them later in life. It wasn't just as simple as sending Japanese soldiers back to Japan to get on with their lives, though, and a lot of guards from the prisoner of war camps had war crimes to answer for. Some of those soldiers who had been involved in war crimes were tried by Allied authorities for various things, ranging from mistreatment and abuse to murder. Some Japanese prison guards were later found to have been involved in mass murder, as rumors spread that Hirohito had surrendered. These men decided the fates of thousands of prisoners and simply executed them en masse. So war crimes trials were more than warranted. Several Japanese officers were tried, 28 in fact, for war crimes, with Prime Minister Hideki Tojo the most high profile. Tojo was sentenced to death for his role in the war and was hanged on the 23rd of December 1948 at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. During the latter years of World War II, the Japanese mainland had come under heavy bombardment from Allied warplanes, and the bigger cities had suffered dreadfully during prolonged bombing campaigns. This meant that there was a lot of work for returning servicemen in the building sector. Many ex-soldiers took up jobs on building sites, where their patriotic tendencies were put to best use in rebuilding the country. However, the Japanese yen had lost a lot of its value in post-war Japan, so it took quite some time for the country and its people to recover. One collective impact of prisoner of war camps on the common Japanese soldier was shared trauma. These were men who had been captured and placed in camps before there was anything approaching a Geneva Convention. So it's safe to say they had been through it. What this meant was that, for most of them, they had very little interest in ever going through that sort of thing ever again. Because of this, many Japanese ex-soldiers went through something of a thought shift, or a mental awakening if you will, and became more committed to the idea of pursuing peace and economic recovery. You only have to take a look at the global powerhouse Japan has become today to see how that shift in mentality ultimately saved the country and propelled them towards becoming one of Asia's biggest economies. Of course, this was the experience of many who actually made it back to Japan immediately after the war. But if you happen to be a Japanese soldier fighting in Manchuria when Hirohito's surrender order came down, then your experiences would have been vastly different. Manchuria had fallen under the jurisdiction of Stalin's Soviet troops, so Japanese soldiers were treated a little less humanely than those who were rounded up by the Americans. The Japanese fighting in Manchuria were sent directly to Siberian concentration camps, or gulags, which later became infamous as some of the worst prison camps in history. With little by way of appropriate clothing for the brutal Siberian winter, many Japanese prisoners of war simply perished of hypothermia. Those who were strong enough to survive had all of their belongings taken from them and were forced to live in barbaric conditions. Add to this the fact that Stalin decided that these men were the ones who should pay for the destruction of Russia during the war. He instantly put them to work repairing roads, railroads, bridges, and other important pieces of infrastructure which had come under attack during the war. Japanese authorities did their best to try to repatriate their soldiers immediately after the war, but with little by way of bargaining chips. Stalin held all the cards. Also, we know how they were treated by their own after being taken captive too. So returning to Japan, although definitely better than a Stalin-era gulag, would hardly have filled a captive soldier with excitement. And spare a thought for men like Hiro Onoda. This was a soldier who, when Japan surrendered, was based on Lubang Island in the Philippines. Onoda and his unit landed on the island on the 28th of February 1945. But almost immediately, most of his fellow soldiers had perished after coming under heavy enemy fire. Onoda, as highest-ranking officer, ordered his 3 remaining subordinates, as well as himself, to take to the hills, where they stayed for the next 29 years undertaking a guerrilla war against the local Filipino population. Onoda finally stood down in 1974 after his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, traveled to the island to relieve him of his duties. As remarkable as this story is, there were other men like Onoda who refused to believe Emperor Hirohito had surrendered. Of course, as you might imagine, many of these men carried their experiences of not just war, but their treatment post-war with them for the remainder of their lives. Not only were they forced to fight for their country, but they were often treated as social pariahs upon return, as they had failed to fulfill their targets. What makes this even more strange is that they were treated this way by people who had not fought for their country, which is quite difficult for people with a Western mindset to comprehend. Western veterans, although sometimes maybe not provided with the tangible help they need once they return, are mostly treated with the respect that should be a given right once they return from fighting for their country. Japan did recover, and it was because of the men who had bravely volunteered their services not only to fight for their country, but to rebuild it in the aftermath of war. These men, unequivocally, should be viewed as heroes in their home nation, which hopefully they are today. Of course, these men suffered untold woes, and as famed writer Agatha Christie put it, one of the saddest things in life is the things one remembers. This has been Nasty History, and I will see you again next time.